The recent Memorandum of Understanding between Alberta and the federal government commits the province to align with Ottawa's evolving methane emissions reduction agenda. The headline target of a 75% cut in methane emissions from 2014 levels by 2035 has been framed as a necessary step in Canada's climate strategy. Albertans and other Canadians should ask, will these methane rules stop at oil and gas, or will they expand into the agricultural sector? Ottawa has already signaled the groundwork for such an expansion. Canada's agricultural sector is responsible for roughly 10% of national greenhouse gas (GHG) emissions. Cattle digesting feed, animals exhaling, manure decomposing, and crop residues breaking down in the soil all release GHGs. Yet under the federal government's accounting, that 10% share places agriculture on par with the emissions attributed to Alberta's oil sands. If the oil sands warrant increasingly strict GHG regulations, it is easy to imagine farmers and ranchers might face similar restrictions later. Ottawa's voluntary agricultural methane reduction challenge is funding research into feed additives and other interventions to reduce emissions from livestock. At the same time, the federal government has set a target to reduce nitrous oxide emissions from nitrogen fertilizer use by 30% below 2020 levels by 2030. While these measures are framed as collaborative and non-binding, voluntary programs often serve as the prelude to mandatory regulations. Meanwhile, the oil and gas sector has been handed its next round of methane rules. Last December, Ottawa finalized new regulations that build on the 2018 framework, which had already required a 40 to 45% reduction by 2025. The new rules tighten leak detection, ban routine venting and flaring, and impose additional monitoring and reporting requirements. Federal estimates suggest these measures will reduce emissions by 304 million tons of CO2 equivalent between 2028 and 2040, but cost industry $14 billion. The first round of methane regulations achieved reductions at significant expense. The second round will amplify those costs, which will ultimately be passed along to consumers. If agriculture is next, Canadians should consider Europe's cautionary tale. Last fall, the EU mandated the use of Bovaer, a feed additive designed to reduce emissions from cattle burps and flatulence. More than 150 scientific studies concluded the product was safe and effective. Yet within 1 month of rollout, farmers across Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and the UK reported alarming outcomes: reduced feed intake, digestive problems, fertility issues, and cattle unable to stand. Several countries immediately paused or scaled back the use of Bovaer and dropped the mandatory requirement. How confidently can we trust the science if Canadian regulations mandate similar products for farmers? Now consider Canada's boreal forest, which contains one of the largest wetland ecosystems on Earth. Its bogs, swamps, and fens release methane continuously through natural biological processes. Ironically, elevated emissions from wetlands are indicative of carbon sequestration or humus material formation. That's the rich black organic material one finds along marshes and bogs. Yet federal inventories focus overwhelmingly on human-caused emissions, while natural emissions are estimated with wide uncertainty ranges and minimal field data. That's because accurately measuring natural methane emissions is extremely expensive, and governments have little appetite to fund such research. Grants overwhelmingly target human-related emissions because that's what policymakers intend to regulate. But when researchers do measure natural emissions, the results are striking. Field studies by Professor Maria Strack at the University of Waterloo using flux chambers in Alberta's northern wetlands suggest natural methane emissions are 5 times higher than the combined methane emissions from Canada's oil and gas and agricultural sectors. That is likely a conservative estimate, as flux chambers are known to significantly underestimate real-world emissions. Given this finding, should farmers and ranchers be penalized for emissions that are unavoidable to food production? If Mother Nature's methane emissions dwarf those from Canadian industry and agriculture, why are we penalizing the latter and ignoring the former? Before Ottawa expands methane regulations into agriculture, Canadians deserve a full and honest accounting of all methane sources, natural and human alike. Anything less risks imposing pain without achieving meaningful climate gain.